got chairs from two other committees who have really big bills coming out this week, so that's where they are.
No worries. Record. Megan Sullivan, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. It is wonderful to be back in this committee. My first time here this year.
But not in your capacity, right?
I was in here last year, I think, a few times, and so with some of my coworkers. Betsy, I think, was in yesterday.
3 years were where we weren't here. People have switched jobs and come and gone. It's still figuring out who's who.
I'm telling you, same with.
There's a lot of us that I haven't figured out who's who either.
So I know last week you had JFO in to talk about what are the different taxes that businesses pay. And they did a lovely PowerPoint. We have a member who creates this pamphlet of tax tables.
I have that.
Oh, do you?
I got one in the mail.
Oh, all right. Well, I brought some for everybody. But I just find it very helpful to sort of as a go-to, what are some of the taxable tables? So I'll pass those around and I have extras if anybody needs them.
I think it's one of my local accountants that sends it.
Probably, yeah. So as a way of introduction, the Vermont Chamber represents businesses of all sizes in all industries in every corner of Vermont. We understand what it takes to help businesses grow and thrive, to build strong and vibrant communities, and our members have trusted us to center stewardship in our mission on advancing the Vermont economy. It's because of this mission that I really appreciate the opportunity to come in today and weigh in on the proposals under discussion in this session. I'd like to start by sort of setting the stage for what's going on in the broader economy that's impacting Vermont businesses, which includes, when we talk about Vermont businesses, we're also talking about nonprofit organizations. They're facing a lot of uncertainty in the economy right now, as the economy continues to show some signs of distress, things like 7% inflation, supply chain disruptions that average about $228 million per year, a historic workforce shortage in the state, 21% wage growth in the state since 2019, falling consumer consumption, ongoing Federal Reserve interest rate hikes, and a 20% increase in healthcare costs. We know that businesses are dealing with this as well as their employees are dealing with many of the same and other issues as well. These are largely outside of the Vermont legislature's jurisdiction, but something that's good for all of us to be aware of. There are additional issues that make Vermont a higher cost place to do business, like unemployment insurance, development costs, taxes, health insurance premiums, energy costs. So as we look at the potential for significant increased taxes to continue to build our social safety net through things like child care, health care, affordable housing, paid family and medical leave, we appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk about what those impacts might be. The potential increased tax burden that could come from these initiatives is amplified by Vermont's demographic challenges. A recent report by JFO said that our aging population implies lower tax revenues per capita, all else being equal. Unless Vermonters age 65 and older decide to leave Vermont in droves, or younger working age people flock to the state in great numbers, Vermont's ratio of old to working age people will continue to rise, placing a greater burden on workers to support both young and old. I would just make a note there that the use of the word old is directly quoted from JFO, and I would use a word like sage or mature.
I'm fine with it.
Okay, duly noted.
None of us in this committee are old.
No, well, no.
I'm
We absolutely want our sage and mature Vermonters to stay and be a part of the communities that they have built and helped thrive through the years. But there's no silver bullet to fix the demographics in Vermont. And there is, so we need to be extra careful as we are stewards of Vermont's tax money, understanding what our demographics mean. And know that money alone cannot solve the problems that we're facing. Even if we had full employment with all people that are currently on unemployment becoming employed and people graduating, staying in Vermont, we would still have about 10,000 job openings. While we look at the collective tax impact of these proposals, it could take a huge toll on Vermonters, and we need to prioritize not only the costs that they have, but also the impact on our workforce shortage in making inroads for our demographic challenges. And this is specifically why housing, which I know isn't our topic today, but just want to say is our top priority. We know that the lack of suitable and affordable housing is impacting Vermonters at every income level and all over the state. Increasing our housing supply will do the most to increase employers' ability to retain and recruit workers. Again, money alone cannot solve this problem, and we are asking for regulatory reform. And other proposals that look for employers to help shoulder the cost, namely paid family medical leave and childcare. We see childcare as the proposal that supports and adds to the workforce. That said, we are focused on seeing that spending is being done in a way that solves problems that workers are facing. Our members tell us that availability of enough slots is their #1 concern. If employers are asked to contribute through a payroll tax, the end result needs to be that parents and guardians have access to the slots that they need, so they are available to participate in the workforce. We're also looking at how funding can be increased this year so that we make progress without increasing taxes on Vermonters. The governor has identified $50 million in funds. We strongly support this year, as we did last year, making the $32 million in the child tax credit specifically for childcare. JFO had identified last year that most families would use that for childcare, and we think it should be a dedicated source of revenue for childcare. Additional funds that could come from things like sports betting could put the amount available this year increase on top of the 125 million that we currently spend at almost another 100 million, which is a huge increase in progress on our child care issue. When we look at how money is spent, we also need to know what is the plan to get to more slots. That the piece that we hear most from employers. There are 9,000 job openings posted on just one job site alone that pay over $45,000 across Vermont. We are dealing with a workforce shortage not only in childcare, but in healthcare, in machine shops, in restaurants, and we've seen how this workforce shortage has impacted businesses in every industry across the state. So when we're talking about how to solve the childcare problem that we're facing, we need to see the plan that gets us to more slots available for parents that recognizes that our workforce challenges are bigger than just this one industry. I've heard this committee talk about engaging in employers that are trying to be part of the solution, whether it's employers that are providing childcare in-house, employers that support their employees with childcare benefits, or employers that provide direct support to centers in the state, doing that through a childcare tax credit for those employers, and we're supportive of that conversation. We know there's been language proposed around that in other states, and happy to try and help facilitate further conversations on that.
Okay. The government is 50 million. Is that ongoing funding he's identified or one time?
My understanding is it's ongoing funding. There's 50 million ongoing and 6 million one time. So 56 total for this year.
Okay. That's interesting. Because other places he's level funded, like mental health. Okay.
Something you just raised, I'd love to know more about. You said other states have looked at possible employer credit. My biggest fear with the tax to support childcare would motivate that it might have the adverse impact of affecting what employers are currently providing for their employees. And so I would love to know what other states are doing to address those circumstances. Employers are already doing great work and giving them some financial credit for that against any obligation for childcare services.
I don't know if it's passed any state yet. We can look into that, but I know that it's been proposed in Maine to do that.
Do you know, it would be helpful to get a count, because all we've heard of lately are employers closing their childcare. Some of our largest employers have childcare. It would be helpful if we could get some kind of an indication as to how many employers actually do contribute to childcare or provide it. And I know you just can, perhaps poll your members. Maybe we'll send a note out to the businesses for social responsibilities. Any other, and see if we can get a sense as to how, is it just a half a dozen, or is it, a couple hundred would make a difference.
Yeah, and I think you'd want to include, want to look at what is the breadth of that, because there are large businesses that have run their own centers, but there are medium or small sized businesses that help subsidize the cost for their employees.
And that would be helpful to know.
Right.
Just to follow up on that, and just my concern is when I think of my personal experience, my wife really wanted childcare close, and if we don't have incentives for employers to provide space for those infants and toddlers close to where they're working, it's going to make childcare even worse. So if you have to drive all the way across town to a centralized location, so I like the idea of any incentive or distributed decentralized childcare.
If you don't have to drive across town, you're lucky. I know people from here that are driving to Chittenden County.
Sure.
Well, and I think, looking at what rural Vermonters are facing, how far do they need to go, and what are we doing to support, to understand what's the childcare availability in those rural areas, and what the impact of changes to a system could be on those centers. And I think
I know last time we looked at this, and it was a few years ago, you had the West Coast, the East Coast, you might have a pocket around Montpelier, and the rest of the state, 90 to 100% of their kids were on, they were on subsidy. And the owners were by and large not collecting the parents' contribution because they knew the kids would go hungry if they did that. So we definitely have different situations. We also need to get the workforce up. From what we're hearing in economic development, since Senator Ron isn't here, housing is primary. That we have the biggest number of college students that leave. A good part of that is they can't find housing.
Right.
Or I've been told housing is 10% more expensive in Boston, but salaries are 50% more. And it doesn't take much benefit to figure out where you go. And so we're working on housing.
you are working on housing.
We are working on housing.
Appreciate that. It
But this one, we need to build capacity, we need to build workforce. It's not like we can just put $200 million out there and have it childcare appear overnight. So, and I have no idea what the childcare bill is doing. We just have to figure out how to pay for it. So we're kind of taking just looks at things that have been suggested as possible payment sources.
Yeah.
Because it is not a small bill.
It is not. And we do think, sorry, I
That's okay.
catching my throat. We do think that And I know it was brought up in the committee before, the child tax credit is an important place to look.
That's definitely on the list.
Great. Happy to talk about paid family leave. Next, unless.
Yeah.
we keep- Okay.
Because I think what I've heard you say so far is childcare would be better if we had to choose.
Childcare, again, we're looking at what, with workforce as our driving issue. Housing is our top priority because we know housing affects all people at every income level. And the ability to retain, promote, and recruit is directly impacted.
We
For
had
all
a
work.
vice president from UVMC who was.
Yeah, I
living-
brought him in.
You brought him in, okay, living in a motel for 7 months. He finally, through somebody who knew somebody, is renting an apartment, but his family's still in Texas.
Family is still in Texas.
Yeah.
And he would be someone we would love to have as a permanent resident of Vermont. He brings
And his
expertise and knowledge.
Income is definitely above the average Vermonters, and he can't find housing.
Many of the Vermont Chamber members are small businesses. And in small businesses, mandated leave programs can significantly impact productivity in operations. One employee on family leave would require an average size Vermont Chamber to operate without 20% of their total workforce for a quarter of the year,
If we do paid family leave,
as proposed.
okay, well, we haven't got it as proposed.
Right, so the current proposal in the House would include, whereas the federal program, small businesses under 10 are not included.
Right,
The current proposal does include.
people, as businesses without any tax. Right, okay. So everybody, all right,
Everybody.
tax tables.
Oh, I see.
I just didn't hear you.
Oh,
It's a light to throw it. No, it's every corner has one.
Oh, okay. As we continue to deal with a significant workforce shortage and given the time and resources required to hire, train, talent, an alternative of hiring temporary replacement worker is difficult, costly, and in many cases ineffective remedy of payroll tax to employers on top of the considerable cost involved in the loss of an employee for 12 weeks would be an economically difficult imposition on many Vermont employers. As goes the success of small businesses, so often goes the success of our communities. The strain on the specific proposal would place on their success is worrisome. Additional considerations need to be given to Vermont's position in the national economy. Many of the state's anchor employers operate in multiple states and cannot implement a benefit program for one segment of its workforce without offering the same benefit to all employees. So creating a program that is an outlier in size and scope and eligibility and cost to other states puts Vermont at a competitive disadvantage. So for the reasons stated, the Vermont Chamber is concerned with the adoption of a new employer mandate for paid family and medical leave at this scale. While we support the principles of paid leave benefit, it is important that the structure of the program be sustainable. The immediate benefits to employees must be carefully balanced with the overall cost of the program and mitigate the potential long-term negative impact on job growth and retention.
Yeah, I didn't see anything under your name. Can you email me? Yeah, and then everybody can read it, go back to when it'll be posted on the website. Senator McCormick.
You said that if Vermont had a more robust child care regime than other states, that would put us at a competitive disadvantage.
No, this is paid family
Sorry,
leave.
you're talking about if we
Oh, okay,
are,
no,
yeah,
yeah, sure, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't say, I'm sorry, and I knew that.
that's okay.
Lost track.
We've covered a lot of topics here.
Yeah, all right, I'll drop the question. I apologize.
Okay. Any other questions for me? Okay, not. Thank you. Sure, we'll see you back. I have no idea what's happening to the main bill. I know it's being worked on, and I know eventually it will come here unless it has no funding attached. But at some point,
Maine with it,
it'll come here,
the main bill meeting.
the childcare bill.
Okay, I didn't know if we're talking.
And I think, I'm not I thought paid family leave was in the House.
It is nice.
That's what I thought. But we are essentially going to tack them all on the board, and we're going to be looking at all possible ways to fund them. And then we'll do what appropriations.
Well, we
We just figure out what we can do or what portions we can do realistically of any bill.
we appreciate the work that this committee has already done this year and really talking about things in sort of a collective vision and understanding what the collective impact of all of the different proposals coming together could be. And that is one of our priorities this year is really making sure that collective look is done, because they will all come down to roost at the same time. So understanding how everything plays together and how we can make progress in a way that is sustainable to advance Vermont's economy.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Eli, welcome.
Thanks.
And just for the record, just
Is this yours?
introduce yourself. And tell us who you are, who you represent, and then we have your name on the record so we know whose voice we're listening to. What picture we're looking at now.
I'm Eli Lister Goldsmith.
Welcome.
Thank you. I just have a little speech and then I'd rather just do Q&A, so I don't have a lot to say.
That's fine.
I'm Eli Lister Goldsmith, second generation Vermont business owner. My family owns Healthy Living, a 3-store natural food supermarket chain based in South Burlington, proudly employing around 300 people. I don't have a big presentation because I'd rather answer questions, but let me break down a few things for the group. First, we are proud Vermonters and business owners. We've operated in Vermont for almost 40 years, since 1986, employing thousands of people over the years. Second, we support early childhood, the early childhood ed movement. We also support paid family leave, and we really support housing reform and development. We have been champions at Let's Grow Kids and both struggle with childcare on the staffing side as an employer and on the personal side with my own 3 little kids in childcare and navigating the system that we all know is broken. So today I'm here to talk about the proposed childcare bill and how it will affect companies like mine and others in Vermont. First, payroll is a company's biggest expense. It's the #1 thing any company in any industry spends money on each year. Let me give you 3 scenarios of 3 different companies. Company 1, small business, yearly top line of around $2 million, payroll around $300,000-400K, maybe an owner and 2 staff, 3 staff. Bottom line might be around $100,000 to $200,000 at the end of the year. So the new tax for them would be around $1,000 to $2,000. Not a big deal. Scenario 1 is the majority of businesses in Vermont. Scenario 2, medium-sized business, yearly top line of around $50 million. Payroll might be somewhere around $11 million. Bottom line could be $1 million, could be $2 million. New tax would be around $100,000. So this would be around a 1/10 of a hit to that company's bottom line. Scenario 3, a big company. Now in Vermont, there aren't gigantic companies like in the rest of the country, but there are some big companies here. Let's say you've got a yearly top line of $100 million. Again, not too many companies like that in Vermont, but the payroll could be $20 to $40 million. So the new tax would be around $300,000. Not a huge deal if the bottom line is 5 to 10 million, but it's still a little bit of a haircut. My point here is this: not all businesses are the same. Most have different top and bottom lines, different margins, different costs and expenses. Applying a broad tax to them all is slightly inequitable. So a couple more points. I do worry that the legislature is trying to tackle a lot of big things at once. Childcare, paid family leave, housing. Just feels like a lot in the same session.
It worries us too.
Especially if we're going to need new revenue streams to fund them all. So I want you to know that the business community, I don't speak for the whole business community, but it's not that we don't want these things, it's that we just need them done in a pragmatic, measured, scheduled way, so that there can be a way to deal with all the changes and all the potential new revenue.
So you would like predictability and not get hit all at once.
Predictability is good for business. You know, most businesses plan 1 to 5 years ahead, so anything you can have from the state telling us like what's coming down the pipe is always pretty good. Just one last thing to say, just to conclude, we love doing business in Vermont. We're not a company that can fold up our tent and leave the state or go offshore or overseas. We're here for the long term, and we are committed to building a great company and helping communities grow and thrive by selling amazing food and products to people who care about their health and wellness. We just want the legislature to be aware of the consequences of new revenue streams on businesses of all sizes statewide. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Committee, any questions? Senator Brown?
You mentioned that there are 3 big things that you're aware of that we're doing, all of which are presumably good and worthwhile, but you're concerned about how much is on our plate, as are we. If you had one who were the choice maker right now, and you had to put in order those 3 things in order of importance, because the last thing you want to do is do a little bit of everything, which means you do nothing. So if you put those things in order, what would be 1, 2, and 3?
For me, it would be housing, childcare, and paid family leave. I really believe, I'm both a real estate, like I'm a lover of real estate. I'm always watching real estate. I felt like COVID was like the big opportunity for Vermont to like bring in a huge new amount of people into the state. We had remote work, we had people not working, we had all this opportunity. And we gained like 5,000 residents in those 2 years. And I look at it like the housing crisis, the housing shortage, the housing, the difficulty it is to build and develop in Vermont really hamstrung us into not growing and not keeping up with the demand. Certain communities boomed during COVID and they brought in tons of new residents, and Vermont, I think, missed a huge opportunity. And that's a bummer for me. I'm a lifelong Vermonter. I've lived here my whole life, and I would love to see more people live here and experience what we all know is an amazing place to live, work, grow a family. And it's just not available to a lot of people. So that's a bummer for me. I think housing is a huge opportunity, and I see a ton of ways the legislature could help ease up some of the things. And I know Senator Hinsdale's working on some of those things. I know some things are in the progress, but we gotta get going on some of these things. I know developers that have basically said, we're not even developing in Vermont anymore. People like Redstone, people, you know, they've gone out of state because it's just too difficult for them.
That's my follow-up question
Sorry.
to what I asked. And that was, now that you've ranked in importance or in priority the things to be done, and housing is first, and you've mentioned the difficulty of getting things done in Vermont, if you were to think of measures that would really be meaningful that the legislature could take, that would make a difference in getting housing built and getting it built in a timely fashion, what would you put as your first 1 or 2 things that we should do?
Well, for me, the 3 biggest obstacles to new development are Act 250, local zoning, and I hate to use the word NIMBYism, but it's like neighbors being able to basically subvert and stop any and all projects that come to the table in towns. And I've seen it now for the entire 20 years that I've been paying attention in my adult life. And you can see it everywhere, in Burlington, in rural communities, Montpelier, everywhere. I think if you chip away at those 3 things, you can you'd see a lot more infill development, some more 3-4 story buildings.
Should we chip away or should we hammer away?
That's for you to decide, Senator.
Well, again, but we're the ones we report to you.
True. I mean, Act 250, I've been talking to Representative McCullough for years, and he, you know, there's a real resistance to reform Act 250, but that's one that definitely needs some action, in my opinion. And then local zoning. I mean, I've experienced it personally in my town. seeing, you know, I live in Charlotte, and we blocked to the point where a health center, it's called Charlotte Community Health, to the point where they just said, forget it. And my whole thing has been, if we can't say yes to a health center, if we can't say in our communities, yes, let's have a place where everyone can go to the doctor, bring their kid, whatever, we got real problems. And it's like, that was the canary in the coal mine to me, to be like, this is so messed up. The neighbors just blocked it and blocked it and blocked it until finally the doctors were like, forget it, we give up.
Yeah.
And that's bad.
Well, half of this committee is on the housing committee, and the other half is on natural resources. And Senator Chittenden is probably going to be the moderator in the civil war that may break out before we
I think
finish.
he's on our side.
I think terminology is important, and so when you say chip away, Act 250, I just always like to say modernize, just to look at it. It wasn't written in the Lord's hand, and there's things we can do to improve and adjust to the times that we need.
I don't think most people in Vermont want McMansions or sprawl or billboard, you know, all the things that we are in fear of. You know, massive developments and high rises, but there's somewhere in between that we can't even get right now. That is really frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, we have been very successful. We have made it, you know, we have protected the natural landscape to the point where people now can't find a place to live here. And to me, Vermont has always treaded a thin line between being a state and a theme park. And when people can't live here.
You're
this-
already there,
Yeah.
Senator.
Yeah, we're
You're
all
already there.
servicing the rich people that can come in, and we have to restore that balance.
You are already there. It's scary.
I think the things we're hearing in housing are very scary. But I'm gonna go face my local planning commission tonight, and I may hear a different thing.
Well, they have a different take on it all.
Yeah. I
And
was
that's
on the
about-
local planning commission, so I was there. Senator McCord.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Vermont is the only state of the 50 that has Act 250.
Yes.
Are we the only state with a housing problem?
I think ours is the worst. We gotta, maybe Senator Rom, you could share the piece. You sent it to the no, Senator Brock, I guess. I got it through, it was an
Professor
email,
Gilbert.
but it had maps. I assume probably
Yes.
Zillow maps of houses in major metropolitan areas under 400,000. Took some of the biggest places in this country. In Burlington, there were none.
Well, I'm not questioning the proposition that Vermont has a housing problem. I'm wondering if Act 250 is
We
the
don't know
cause. It would seem to me if one of the just basic, you do it with science all the time, X happens and B happens, so X must have caused B.
Right.
And one of the ways you test that is, are there other places where X happens and B doesn't happen?
Right.
And are there other places where B happens without X?
Right.
And the country is going through a housing crisis. Okay, I've made my point on that. But the other thing I want to ask is, often when I hear about Act 250 having impeded development, it's like it's a given that that was a bad thing. Do you know what the substantive objections were to the project you're talking about?
The health center,
Yeah,
man, I think there was some wetland stuff. I think there was some parking stuff. I think there was some, you know, you probably know way more than me.
No, I mean, it was a
Lighting,
everything falling in under its own weight, and that's happening a lot with local things. If it's not one thing, it's another until it's too many things back to back to back.
you know, this whole like form-based code, which has become popular in the last 10, 15 years, like that has really made a lot of communities accelerate development while still protecting environmental concerns. So if you just write in some of these things into the form-based code, things can go a little bit faster. I'd love to see more towns adopt form-based code, which I believe makes a lot of sense.
Okay, well, Senator Warren is shepherding us through that one, and I think you can hear some of the arguments that will be made by the other half of this.
It's like jets and sharks in here.
So anyway, all we're gonna do is figure out how to pay for it in here. Everybody else can find out the details. We just pay. So, any other questions, Senator Bryant?
I used to live in Charlotte, so I'm just curious, was this health center, Bunky Bernstein was there for a long time, down towards the railroad tracks below? Store. Is this what we're talking about?
An existing health center changed owners and lost all of its capacity to keep up.
Now they're gone. So they
Now
don't
you
even,
have to drive to another county.
Well, it's so
for
funny.
environmental.
it's so funny because I grew up in Underhill, then I moved to Burlington, and my doctor was in Williston all these years, so I was trekking out to Williston, not that far. Then I moved to Charlotte, and I'm like, oh, there's a health center right here, so I joined it. A month later, they closed up shop and left, so now I'm driving back to Williston. So, you know, it's not the end of the world, but it's
Like
annoying.
we're trying to limit emissions.
Then it is the end of the world.
This does not help.
And it's like that builds community too, like that's what we're trying to do, like, again, it's not a bullet factory or a gas station or like, it's a doctor's office. And we couldn't even get that through, and I think that is just a sign of the dysfunction in development in Vermont.
Well, Charlotte's very particular about what happens in its borders.
They are, but maybe that's not that cool.
Well, yeah, no, I'm not praising it, I'm just
Okay,
saying.
we're running
Sorry.
over time.
Having lived there, I noticed it was a lot of scrutiny happened to every project.
Okay, Senator Chitman.
I was just gonna say, Act 250, it has had good positive effects for Vermont, so it's, I don't want, nobody wants to say, throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. What we're talking about here is just reforms at the local level and the state level to find better paths to create community. Sorry.
You see, the more and more I listen to this, affordable housing is more plentiful in states, counties, and neighborhoods where people really don't want to live if they can avoid it.
Where don't they want to
I
live?
thought so.
They don't, the affordable housing is where people don't want to live if they can avoid having to live there. That's where the affordable housing is.
Right now, there's just no stock.
Excuse me?
There's not a huge swaths of affordable housing sitting open because no one wants to live there in Vermont. Do you mean in the country?
Everywhere.
I think lower, yes,
Like lower
traditionally,
home
lower
prices.
income housing has been packed together in inner cities, and anybody that could got out to the country and, or the suburbs. And we are now trying to limit that sprawl. We always have in Vermont. But we haven't put the housing in the cities either, or towns, and we have a housing crisis. We can't get teachers, we can't get doctors, we can't get nurses. We can't get workers for your local factories or businesses because they can't afford the housing.
And one last point I want to make to the senator, I don't want my rating to say my ranking to say for a second that I don't think the childcare
Right.
bill or the paid family leave thing are incredibly important. I don't want to discount that or the work that's been done on those at all. Because I think those are definitely needed and meaningful as well.
Any other questions?
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Emily, we're gonna switch gears again.
Possible vote. 10 are here together.
Ah, okay, good, we got a dog puppy show.
Ted is gonna do most of it.
Okay,
I don't think Ted has been in.
I don't know, I just.
not.
Welcome.
You appreciate it?
Johnny Driscoll frequently rents seats in this room, so you may see more of us.
Yes, I'd like to get around that deal.
But yeah, so we,
We are
Your
going,
TIF
no, we're
also.
going to do,
Yes.
the
I agree.
pass-through
No, that's
income.
his jurisdiction.
Oh,
I'm
we're
sorry.
gonna do tips, well, then we're definitely gonna see a lot of you.
Yes.
And Ted has sort of been my, so I'm right, yes.
That's right, yes.
I will be, I think I've been saying tapping out at halftime.
I know, I'm like, I need one of those also. I hope I don't, but.
So yeah, Ted is, we're gonna let Ted take the reins on this one.
Okay.
I'm here to provide support and, yeah, so we thought, it'd be important for us to provide some just overall fiscal considerations on S45. There was an issue brief that Graham Campbell wrote last year, so a lot of this is taken from that issue brief that he did, which sort of provides some of that fiscal context for your consideration as you decide whether or not to vote the bill out. Yeah, great, I'll let Ted take it away. Should we, Jill, should we share screen or?
I could share it if you want.
What
Or
do
you
you
can join
want?
a Zoom and I'll make you a co-host and you could share.
If you could share, that might be easier, because I'd have to hop on Zoom. All right. So starting on slide number 2, just giving a general outline of what we're going to talk about here today. Bring the legislation back to front of mind here. In the first step, then talk about the distribution of who is reporting partnership and S corp income on their tax returns. We're going to talk a little bit about the state revenue impact, and then finally some considerations for you all as you're taking this bill up. Moving on to slide 3. I first want to talk about who is a pass-through business. Pass-through businesses get their profits are passed through to the owners who then pay on their own personal income taxes. That takes one of 3 forms. You can be an S corporation, and that is, you can have one or more than one, have one or more shareholders up to 100. The S stands for small business corporations, and you file a Schedule E on your 1040. It also includes partnerships, so that's 2 or more individuals own or operate a business. They have equal ownership rights. They also file a Schedule E on their 1040. And then finally, it's sole proprietors. Profits go to a single owner. These sole proprietors are not really a part of this legislation, but they are a pass-through. So wanted to include them in this group. Moving on to slide number 4, I wanted to talk about all of the different, there's so many different pass-through entities, right? It really runs the whole spectrum. It could be everything from a handyman who earns income as a side business. It could be a small accounting firm with 3 partners. It could be a medium-sized manufacturing firm with 100 employees as a single owner. And it could also be a large multi-state financial firm with billions of dollars in assets and 10 partners. So really, when thinking about legislation in this group, it really can impact a large slice of businesses throughout the economy. And then on slide number 5, we have some key features of S45. It would create a entity level tax of 7.6%, which is the second highest marginal personal income tax rate. The entity tax level hits at the business income earned by the entity and gets passed through to the owners. The legislation would also create a refundable 90% personal income tax credit on those personal or the pass-through entity taxes paid. The credit would also include the amount of pass-through entity taxes paid to other states. The tax is elected. It must be elected by all of the members of a pass-through entity, and it must be renewed yearly. And then finally, the legislation becomes effective on January 1, 2023. So with kind of the key nuts and bolts of things in mind, I wanted to move on to the distribution of pass-through income and how it's reported on tax forms. So that is moving on to slide number 6. And so here, this is from data, the most recent data in 2020. The first thing to keep in mind is that a small number of returns in Vermont report pass-through income. So of the 350,000 tax returns that are filed in Vermont, 6% of them, or almost 21,000 report passive income. And of that group, high income individuals are much more likely to report passive income. So if you look at the $50,000 to $75,000 range, only 5% of tax returns in that income group report kind of have S corp or partnership income on them. But when you get up to between $500,000 and $1 million in income, that proportion becomes 50%. And $1 million more, you're looking at over 2/3 of filers.
I think the one thing I was just highlight, right, this is just it's not all pass-through income, just the S
Right.
corps and the partnerships, right? So sole proprietorships are not part of, would not be subject to the pass-through entity taxes. It's just looking at S corps and.
Yeah, sole proprietorship, there's nothing really to pass it through.
No, yeah, and the way that the legislation is structured, they wouldn't be eligible for the pass-through entity tax.
Oh, wow.
Folks have that.
So moving on to slide number 7. So looking at this distribution, wanted to make the point that most of the folks who are reporting S corp or partnership who have that income on their tax returns, they're between $0 and $50,000. So 82% of the overall returns with that income on it are less than $50,000. But when you look at the overall income reported, that number changes quite a bit. So you have 247 returns that had net income above 500,000, and they reported 40% of the total net income of that group. Moving on to slide number 8. We then wanted to look at the set of groups who are impacted by the SALT cap, which the SALT cap came about in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so these are folks who are paying more than $10,000 in state and local taxes and choose to itemize. With the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the standard deduction was increased, so fewer folks are itemizing. But when we ran the numbers, it turned to about 21,000 of the Vermont resident returns are impacted by the SALT cap. And that impact really starts to kick in at above $200,000 of AGI. So for returns between $150,000 and $200,000 in income, only 44% of returns in that group are impacted, but that increases to 72% at between $200,000 and $3,000 in income. So this is shown in the table in the next slide, in slide 9. So again, highlighting that as you get up the income scale, more resident returns are impacted by the SALT cap. So at every income group above 200,000, it's above 70%, but at lower levels of income, the share is much smaller.
Questions at this point? So far, so good?
All right.
Oh, you do?
I have a sub S corporation. And my sub S corporation rents its land to a farmer. I am the farmer to whom it rents the land. And does this mean that I'm suddenly going to be able to get the taxes that I pay, that the S corporation pays, back again as a business expense?
You would have to be a member of that S corp.
It's my S corporation.
Yes, yeah.
I'm trying to think about, that's a good question for Abby Shepherd, I think, from Ledge Council.
Yeah.
Where, yes.
Seems awful convenient. So
Well, you may not be paying in state and local taxes above the cap. You can only deduct, you can deduct a certain amount. It's those that owe, is it 100?
More than 10,000.
It's more than 10,000, yeah. So if you're not paying more than 10, if you're paying more than 10,000 in state and local taxes, then you might, but if you're not paying that, and this is, yeah, then you wouldn't be covered.
It would, yeah, it depends on if you itemize, depends on your total income, like sort of all of it, whether or not it makes financial financial sense to pay the pass-through entity tax and then take the credit that is a net benefit.
Sounds like an accountant.
When I was I'm feeling guilty that I might be able to take this. Now I can complain because I'm a little guy, I can't.
There are people that this will not help. I know that.
One portion of the earlier part of the discussion, I may be missing or I don't quite understand. There was a provision that indicates that the pass-through entity is charged at a tax rate of 7%. And I would think that if you're an individual sole proprietor and you're conducting a business, wouldn't you be taxed at your personal income tax rate rather than 7%?
Yes, this is the pass-through entity tax itself, so that income would get carved out of your personal income through the credit, and then you'd pay the 7.65% on the pass-through on your S corp or partnership income, and it wouldn't be part of your personal income tax anymore. And then you take a credit for those taxes paid on your personal income tax.
Okay, so you take a credit on that. The purpose of the credit is to lower that rate. Again, I'm perhaps just missing what the purpose of this is.
So would.
My understanding is that the idea of the credit would be so you don't double pay. So the entity is paying first, and then on the leftover income, you would want to have to pay at the entity level, and then on your personal income at the same, right?
So you get a credit back, but is the credit back of the same amount or of a different amount?
It's 90%, yes.
90%.
Right now.
So that's the sole purpose then, is to get that portion, because of the state tax rate as opposed to, okay, I got it, I understand.
Right now, you're paying it all to the feds.
Understood.
This way, you're paying
The
10%.
purpose of it is to get the ability to get the federal portion back.
Right.
Or 90% of the federal portion back.
Okay.
Excuse me. So on slide 10, you started looking at the size of potential federal tax benefits that would be unlocked as a result. And so if you repeal the SALT cap for S corps and partnership returns, or folks who are reporting that income on their returns, Vermont tax filers would experience an estimated benefit of a very specific number, 33.84 million. That would be a reduction in their federal tax liability. And because of the way that most of the income is coming to folks at the higher ends of the income distribution, more than 70% of those tax savings would accrue to folks who have an AGI of 500,000 or more. And that's only about 0.23% of total returns.
Okay, this said, if the SALT cap was repealed.
Yes.
It was repealed in 2025, 26, and this is basically for 1 or 2 years. If it was repealed, would this pass-through legislation be repealed at the same time?
Not the way that, my understanding is not the way the bill is currently drafted.
Okay, we did discuss that, because I don't think we're interested in giving anybody a double dip. Could you, if it continued, just keep paying it through the corporation and paying the state? That would make no sense. You could deduct it from your federal, all of it. So this should end when the SALT exemption ends.
I would guess if the SALT exemption cap went away, then they wouldn't want to elect this because then they could take the whole 100%
They
at
can
their
take
personal
100,
level,
not
not the 90%.
So, yeah, this should cease to exist. And if the feds renege, then we'll.
There is an open, it is scheduled to sunset for federal legislation, but that doesn't mean that Congress could, who knows what Congress will end up doing, right? So-
Or if it goes according to normal, they probably will do nothing for 6 months and just keep arguing about whatever bill it's stuck in. And then, yeah, and so we will say until it is actually repealed. I think that this, but if we do this legislation will stay in effect. Okay, okay. Brock.
Another issue, you mentioned S corporations, partnerships, and sole proprietorships. You didn't mention LLCs.
So I know we are focusing on S corps and partnerships because of the way the data are reported. But yes, LLCs are part of this legislation as well.
But my understanding is that the LLC is not a pass-through entity if it only has one member. Is that correct?
That's a good question for our ledge council.
All right,
I don't want to speak out of turn on that.
okay.
Venture, yes, to the response, but probably want to hear more authoritatively.
Okay.
I can speculate a response in the break if you like.
Okay. I will interpret it as speculation. And treat it accordingly.
Do you have something to share?
So my understanding was LLCs can also allow for non-persons, trusts, or entities as owners. They could be international members, and that would disqualify them from.
But it, just like as you have the issue of a partnership, all the partners have to be US
Right.
residents under this to qualify. And I'd assume the same thing would hold true. And they have to be individuals. And I think the same thing would hold true with LLCs, but I just don't see it specified there to.
Yeah, I remember the discussion when we first went through this, that it had to be real persons, not corporate or
Right.
legal persons. And
They all have to choose it too.
they all have to choose, yeah. They do not all have to be residents, because we already do things with non-resident
If
members.
they meet that, they could qualify, but not all of them are qualified.
Okay,
It's pretty complicated.
all taxes are complicated, all right.
No. For low and moderate income people are not complicated at all. They're taken out of your check.
That's
They're
right,
gone.
but you get a refund, hopefully.
For wheelers and dealers. they're complicated.
Well, that's why they make money. Okay, so this is a 10 to 20 million dollar. I think that's where we ended up, right?
Yes,
Okay,
that is correct. Yes, so in the issue brief, calculation estimates
On the slide, it is covered in the text of the bill.
estimates a $10 to $20 million federal tax benefit, and this part of this difference is because the take-up matters, and so it is elective. We're anticipating that not everyone will take it, and so that generates the $10 to $20 million federal tax benefits. And again, we have another table which breaks this down based on income group. And so most of the benefits, as I mentioned in the previous slide, are accruing at higher levels of the income distribution. That is on slide 11.
here we go.
Great, so the federal tax benefits, as one would expect, at between 100,000 and 125,000 or 300,000. And it increases as you move up the scale. And for $1 million and more, the federal tax impact is estimated to be 15 million. And the other point here is that an even a smaller group of filers have a positive S corp or partnership income that they've reported. Moving on to slide 12. I'm going to discuss briefly the state revenue impact. And really, it depends on the design of the pass-through entity tax and credit. Different states do this in different ways. Here, it is going to be positive because of the difference between the credit and the highest marginal tax rate. I honestly had to do the math a few times to make this make sense for me. But when the inverse of the credit is higher than the marginal personal tax rate, there's going to be a positive revenue generation. We don't have a formal estimate at this time, but it's not likely to be significant. On the next slide, I'm going to show an example for someone who has $1 million in passive income and how that works out. The other thing is that we were looking at this, we looked at other states to see if they had revenue projections. And for the most part, either they don't have one or they forecast very minimal changes. So this kind of jives with the
So
idea
we
that
can't apply, we aren't gonna be able to fund childcare with this.
that is correct.
That's all we care about, all right.
Right. And so on slide 13, showing, this is kind of a little bit of a mini example here, but for a business with net income of $2 million with two partners who split it 50-50, and their pass-through income is $1 million, under the current law, where they pay that in their personal taxes, they will be paying $78,668 in state income tax, and their federal income taxes is $219,449. The back end of this is an Excel calculator. And then with the personal entity tax, or the pass-through entity tax, they will pay their share of the state entity tax, which is $76,000. So on that $1 million, they're paying 7.6%. And then the difference between what they would pay in the state income tax and that credit that they're getting for the state entity tax is $3,618. And so at the end of the day, what that means is that their total state taxes increase by $950 in this example, but their federal tax liability decreases by $22,000, almost $500.
Almost 23. Okay, but the state revenue would be $950.
Exactly,
Definitely not gonna fund childcare.
unfortunately.
Okay,
And that, so this assumes a 90% credit at this
Right.
point. There's a lot of math that could be done in terms of what that credit is. If you shrink it, potentially generating more revenue, but then you also, on the flip side, the taxpayer is has to do their own personal calculation to determine whether or not
they're
that's
gonna do it.
worth it
Yeah,
for their bottom line. So there's that. Different states have a different credit amount.
okay, so we should probably just look at this as something that we shouldn't start spending this yet. We should, and it's only for a couple of years, so this really isn't a way to raise revenue. It is a way to help out businesses who hopefully will some of that money in. All right. Okay, is that it?
So we have some considerations. I see the commissioners here, so I can move through them quickly. So the four considerations that were in the issue brief and that I'll present for y'all is, one is a PTE tax treats classes of income differently. Second, when thinking about vertical equity, does that consideration extend beyond Vermont's tax code to the federal code or the overall income distribution? It also talks about legislators considering the impacts of creating tax policy solely in response to changes in federal policy. And then finally, just noting that this would introduce a third business tax option into the tax code. I have some follow-up slides to slide 15. So this treats different classes of income differently. And so a pass-through entity tax is only available to S corps or partnerships. And so that is only, as we talked about earlier, 6% of returns. Their taxpayers who earn their income through wages or Social Security would not be able to access it. Also, sole proprietors who are a type of pass-through entity, as we discussed in the beginning, would also not be able to access it. So it treats that group differently. And then generally, preferential treatment of a certain type of income to come with a goal. And so if the goal of the tax is to promote economic activity, looked at some of the research and there's little effect of preferential pass-through entity rates on economic activity. And there are other, just want to note there are other policies that can promote economic activity. And then, is the goal here to provide tax relief to this group of taxpayers?
And that, we do have your hand up. And I think we will have you back at another time to help us think through some of the questions that you raise or issues that you raise.
Sure.
Yeah, because it is a very small and potentially wealthier group of taxpayers that this would help. Okay. So there is some equity discussion there. All right. Okay. Any questions? Thank you. We will have you back. Rent in the seat, you can see me about it.
Sure. Is it daily, monthly?
It's annually, and
Okay.
you might get a cushion in there for a surcharge.
All right, that sounds like a good deal.
Actually, we used to have nice cushion. Well, there's a cushion chair there that's reserved for staff.
Great.
But we used to have more comfortable chairs. Somehow we found old chairs. Okay, Commissioner Bolio. One up. Commissioner, you asked to tell us about the governor's other tax proposals. We've had you in on this one,
Yes,
but not on all the other ones.
That's
So we thought we'd hear about them.
yeah, for the record, Craig Olio, Tax Commissioner, I appreciate that, Madam Chair, the opportunity to come back and speak with the committee about the other proposals. I do have a slide deck that Maude is going to run for us. Thank you, Maude. There are a few slides at the beginning of it that talk about the pass-through entity tax, so I will skip over those because we've already gone through that, but I just wanted everybody to have a consolidated package if useful.
Yeah.
It
It is on our website.
Perfect. Oh, there we go. So you just have to start. There you go.
Right,
Perfect.
okay, that's that.
So Maude, if you could move to slide 2, please. The next one, perfect. So overall, the package is building on the great work that was done in Act 138 from last year, as members of the committee from the prior session know. So it's areas that the legislature and administration have worked on together before and hoping to build on that work. There's 2 elements to it, there's more than 2 elements to it, but a state impact and a federal impact. So the state impact is $17 million in state tax reduction. And then also, of course, as we've talked about before, the $10 to $20 million as forecasted by JFO for the SALT cap workaround. And of course, all of these provisions are accounted for in the governor's recommended budget. Skip all the SALT cap workaround slides unless the committee has any final questions or concerns on that policy. If you're good to go.
Just one question, just to clarify that LLCs are treated like partnerships in this. Is that basically?
They can elect on how to be treated.
Yeah.
Most elect to be treated like partnerships, so then they would qualify. Single member.
It
LLC.
wasn't covered in JFO's presentation. I just want to make sure that I read this correctly, that LLCs and are their members, but they have to follow the same rules that a partnership does. In other words, be individuals as opposed to corporate entities.
Yeah, I mean, I think they can theoretically elect to be treated as a C Corp for tax purposes if they want.
If they want.
Don't.
Yeah.
And then the single member LLCs are almost all disregarded entities filing on Schedule C, and so this wouldn't apply anyway. So this is LLCs with more than one member, your goal.
Correct, that's where I was over there.
Yep.
Well, one of the things that JFO mentioned that in some cases that individual proprietorships would qualify, and that was not my understanding, because they would not be pass-through entities unless they were something like LLC.
Yeah, if they're filing on Schedule C, they would not qualify. But I think those are all deductible anyway.
Yeah.
So I think it's not relevant for that.
Okay.
It was unclear from your last presentation regarding the sunset, and if there is a sunset, if we need a sunset, or if a sunset should be tied to the federal legislation. But if the federal rule changes, would it be fair to say that somebody would not choose to elect this because that would get the 90% rather than the full percent? Or would you recommend this committee consider a sunset tied to the federal action on this?
I'm open to a sunset that's tied to the federal cap expiring. I don't think there's a need for this structure if the SALT cap doesn't exist. And so I do see some benefit for everybody if this structure goes away, if the SALT cap goes away, because I worry about maintaining it on the forms when there's no real value to it. I worry about taxpayers who don't understand that there may not be value to it anymore, filing with it and then sorting that out. So I'm very open to that. I think you also asked about like if the cap changed, like if it went from 10,000 to 30,000, you'll have fewer people electing the treatment, but you'll still have some people electing the treatment, and it's still free money to the state. So my recommendation on that would be to have the sunset be if the cap fully goes away. If the cap is raised, there's still some value. It'll be diminished value, but there will still be value. And if we have stood it up and stood up all the infrastructure, unless it was a really, really high cap, I would still see some value in having that. But I'm very open to a sunset that's tied to the sunset of the cap at the federal level.
We'll work it out.
Yeah, I think we'll do one cap. And if they don't raise it, given that the bulk of the value seems to be in the higher brackets, just raising it a little bit probably won't have that much of an impact, because the benefit really is to high income taxpayers.
Yeah, and you're still gonna have the same dynamic of free federal tax cuts for whoever qualifies. Again, I'm happy to help support however I can. The one last piece I would say on the SELCAP work around the governor's recommended budget is booking $500,000 for that. And that is a straight mathematical exercise off of the JFO estimate of 10 to 20 million. We said, let's call it 15. And then for math that I could prove if the committee would like, the state sees about 3.25% of whatever the federal savings is. So if there's federal savings of about 15 million, the state should see about $500,000 up with a 90% credit.
Okay.
So Maud, if we could please go to slide 7, the one for the earned income tax credit. And so the governor's proposing to increase the state earned income tax credit to 45% of the federal credit. This is one of the greatest federal tax credits ever created. It helps put more money in the pockets of low, modest, working class Vermonters. There have been a number of studies from people in this space talking about its anti-poverty impacts, and it's based on earned income, so it has a lot of benefits in terms of incentivizing workforce participation. Members of this committee may remember that last year it was increased from 36% to 38% of the federal credit. States around the country, I think the number is up to about 30 now, have some version of the earned income tax credit. So this is common around the country. It's done in a whole slew of different ways. So some follow the federal qualifications and offer a percent like Vermont does. Some are refundable, some are not, some are higher percentages. Some have their own calculation, which I tend to advise against because of the complexity of it. I think we get some real value in Vermont from doing it with the federal qualifications. So all of that said, I think at the end of the day, Vermont is in the upper echelon of the credit that we offer for earned income tax credit, but I do think there are 3 jurisdictions around the country that have a more robust earned income tax credit than we do.
California, New York, and who else?
It's actually none of those. It's Maryland, DC, and New Jersey. So California's is 45% fully refundable, but they have lower income thresholds than the feds.
Okay.
And there's also if you look at South Carolina, on the surface, it looks like they're more robust because it's 80% of the federal credit, but it's not refundable, right? So for this audience, refundability is a big deal. So when I'm saying more robust than Vermont's, I'm saying at least as generous as our qualifications and fully refundable with a higher percentage. So Maud, if you could move to the next slide, we'll look at some details on those other jurisdictions. I realize my fonts are all over the place. Apologies about that. But Maryland, the first one, has 45% refundable. They have a really interesting calculation in that they have, for those who don't have children, they offer 100% of the federal credit. And then they offer, and it's weird every time I say it, they offer a 50% credit for the non-refundable portion of their credit. And then the refundable portion is 45%.
Only a
all of that,
legislature can do that.
I didn't believe it when I first read that those were the instructions, and then our team looked at it and that was the case. But ostensibly, you could look at it simplified as 45% fully refundable with actually slightly more generous qualification terms than ours as well. And so against our 38%, I would say Maryland is more generous. DC has gotten a lot of press for their program over the last couple of years. Theirs is now up to 70% of the federal credit. Again, those without children get 100% of the federal credit, and DC is actually scaling theirs up through tax year 2026 so that everyone will get 100% of the federal credit by 2026. And they have the same federal qualifications as we do for those with children, and without, they have a higher income ceiling.
Pays with the credit in DC.
I'm asking myself
Federal
that question.
government pay,
That's a robust program there. I was
Yeah.
sort of intrigued by that question myself,
I'm
but I don't have
wondering
an
if
answer. for
Congress
you.
is actually footing the bill on both ends.
And then New Jersey is maybe not quite as straightforward, but it's 40% fully refundable. It is a little more restrictive than our qualifications in that those without children are not eligible in New Jersey. But in an ordinary year, about 95% of the money for EITC goes to those with kids in Vermont. So the vast, vast, vast majority is going to those with qualifying children. And that's a function of the program. The amount of credit scales up very quickly as you get qualifying children. And then again, Vermont at 38% fully refundable, I would argue is probably the fourth most robust and generous in the country. If we move to 45%, if the governor is proposing, we will be right at the top except for DC. So I would say we would be tied for the most generous state. Maryland, again, around the edges might be a little bit more generous than us, but in terms of fully
Okay, so
refundable
it's, I
percentage,
thought I heard 40, it's 45?
45% is the governor's.
45, okay,
And that is a base revenue impact of 5.25 million each year.
okay. So that's money going out.
There'll be revenue reduction, yeah.
But going into our people earning.
Yes.
That's right, yeah, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't have the income thresholds off the top of my head, but they're relatively low. If there are no questions, I'm happy to move to the next slide, and this is on the existing Social Security tax exemption. So the governor is proposing to increase those thresholds by $15,000. It's not on the slide, but I would also note the governor's proposal increases the thresholds for the civil service retirement system to move in conjunction with 15,000.
I think we've tried to float all boats the same,
Yes, that's
so we'll.
Yeah, and so again, under current law, this was expanded $5,000 last year in Act 138. So current law is that single filers up to 50,000 of income and joint filers up to $65,000 of income can get a full exemption, and that phases out over the next $10,000 of income. However, 39 states, as shown on the slide, either fully exempt Social Security from income tax or they don't have state income tax at all. And part of the challenge from the governor's perspective here is that the inflation rate has made the Social Security COLA more substantial than has been seen in years. And so, especially if you have two people on Social Security, married filing joint, there's a real chance that those folks will get pushed up that income spectrum and maybe out of qualification for the exemption. So pushing this up by 15,000 would let more seniors retire comfortably, worry less about paying the bills, and also help make sure that the bill that was passed last year by the legislature maintains its impact with the rate of inflation. And if we move to the next slide, I show just the map that talks about the breakdown of states. So blue means there's no state income tax, green means there's a full state exemption, yellow means there's a partial exemption. You see Vermont in yellow there. And then red I've listed as no state exemption, though I would note federally there's an exemption for 15% minimum for everybody. And I believe, don't quote me 100%, but I believe all of those states at least follow the federal treatment that are labeled in red. So it's just no state exemption for that. So you can see, again, a lot of our neighbors are in either full exemption or no state income tax at all, in the case of New Hampshire, of course. Happy to move on if there are no questions, Madam Chair. Okay. The next slide is one that will be very familiar to long-term members of the committee, but the governor is again proposing to fully exempt military retirement pay and survivors benefits. Obviously, an issue that's very close to his heart.
Survivors benefits, didn't we, last year?
I don't believe that was part of the bill last year. I believe it was just, so I think what was passed in Act 138 was just for the military pensions themselves.
I remember adding survivors benefits, maybe it didn't make it on. We didn't? I thought we
Yeah, we
did.
discussed it.
You thought we did?
I know we discussed it, and I'm not sure it may have gone out of it. I didn't think it went through the final bill.
I don't believe it did, but I'm happy to.
Check on that. I
find
know we
out.
put it in, maybe it was just exempt up to the same level. No, we exempted all.
I know what we
Yeah.
wanted to do.
We'll check on that. We'll find out.
Yeah, so my understanding of current law is that the military retirees can deduct the first 10,000 of their pension up to the same income limits on the Social Security exemption, and also you can only pick one of them. And so one of the.
You turn 65.
Yeah, so one of the challenges is once you are receiving Social Security, it's difficult for me to imagine a scenario in which a military retiree is better off taking the military pension exemption compared to the Social Security exemption. They would basically need to have less than $10,000 in Social Security. Again, looking around the country, if you could move to the next slide for me, please, Maud. 38 states either fully exempt military retirement pay or again, don't have state income tax. So here again, the blue is no state income tax, green is full exemption, yellow is partial exemption. Again, you see Vermont in yellow. And then actually, interestingly, red with the no state exemption, there used to be 3 states. There used to be California, Virginia, and Vermont. Both Virginia and Vermont put in a partial exemption last year. California remains the only one that doesn't have an exemption. From the governor's standpoint, right, there's really 2 elements to this. One is celebrating the service that those retirees undertook and dedicating usually 20 years of their lives to military service. And also the JFO has cited a national figure that 70% of military retirees retire between the ages of 35 and 50. So it's very likely that they're taking a second career and that this could be a workforce enhancement mechanism as well.
Still don't celebrate draftees.
Say that again?
Draftees are still not celebrated.
In this proposal, it's military retirees.
It's nothing with orders.
That's a good reminder.
It is the 20 years.
Officer,
Well,
Oh,
no,
20
you can,
years.
it's
Okay.
20 years.
Okay.
And there is no work. The argument is they'll come here and work.
right.
Draftees come here and work soon.
Yeah, but there is no work requirement on this. This could be somebody that's worked for the military industrial complex for 10 years and pulled down 6 figures.
If you have a proposal for draftees, I'm sure the governor would be happy to look at it.
Do you know if other states have found a way to honor people who didn't serve in the military for 20 years?
Not a topic I know a lot about off the top of my head. I'd have to do some research in terms of tax policy.
We did find out several years ago that most of these exemptions went in the late 40s and the 50s, which legislatively is really smart because you'd have to pay the bill for 20 years. And Vermont did a reduction in your property value. So it's not that we did nothing for veterans. I'm assuming the veterans said, I don't have any income, but property tax is killing me. And that's what we did. Act 60 actually made it better.
And that's all veterans.
I think
I think it's in your-
80,
Okay. Oh, right, that's right, okay.
but we did do something. And now we're here. But it isn't that we just said, oh, forget veterans.
Right, that's right.
We did. Okay. That it?
No, I got one more.
Okay.
And I actually don't know if this is one I've spoken with this committee about before. If you could move to the next slide, please, for me, Maud. So this is a proposal to simply repeal Vermont's personal income alternative minimum tax. I think it's not doing its job anymore post 2018 after Vermont underwent the income tax reform in response to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, where Vermont no longer recognizes itemized deductions. So under current law, basically, if the adjusted gross income of a taxpayer exceeds $150,000, the tax is either what's calculated under the normal tax calculation or 3% of adjusted gross income. Normally, what an alternative minimum tax is trying to do is function as a backstop for people who have significant deductions. But again, pre-2018, Vermont recognized itemized deductions, and now they don't. And so the challenge is now there's really 4 groups of people who are getting impacted by this. The first are those with high medical deductions. which is something that the legislature reinstituted in 2019 with very specific rules. Those who are following the state's rules on bonus depreciation, Vermont does not recognize accelerated depreciation schedules, which means in the first year after buying a capital asset, if you take that accelerated depreciation schedule at the federal level, you have to do an add back for Vermont, and then in your out years, you will subtract that. But there are taxpayers who have subtractions that are so large because of that standard depreciation schedule that they are actually triggering the alternative minimum tax, which practically means they were never able to depreciate that portion of their asset to the degree that it was over the alternative minimum tax. There's also those with the capital gains exclusion, which again has very specific rules under state law. And then the fourth group is a small one, but an important one, which is those who have high amounts of interest from US bonds or railroad retirement income, which under federal law, we are actually not allowed to tax. And so this is sort of a backdoor
So
way.
if you're
of
a
taxing those.
retiree on a railroad pension, you're gonna pay the minimum tax.
You could. And if you could go to the next slide, Maud, it'll show
This
sort of
is
the
one
data.
We have not talked about.
Actually,
before, so
one more.
We will get Ledge Council and everybody in to talk about it.
Yeah, and this slide is really telling to me. This is tax year 20 and tax year 21. The biggest note that I would make between 20 and 21 is you'll note in 2021, there are more under the capital gains exclusion that are triggering the AMT. As you might remember, asset prices were very high in 2021, so it was a little bit of an anomalous year in terms of capital gains, right? But if you look at 2020, for every dollar in alternative minimum tax that you're getting from those triggering the capital gains exclusion, you're getting $7.74 from those with high medical deductions and $2.27 from those who are just following our depreciation rules. In 2021, it's $3.40 from those with medical expenses and $1.41 for those with bonus
I
depreciation.
think
So
we're gonna have a deeper dive.
Yeah. I mean, this is this is one that I feel like is just a sort of vestigial relic of the pre-2018
Maybe, but
days.
yeah. But knowing that we know, so those are medical expenses that are deducted from
Schedule A, yeah, like federally
Schedule A,
qualified.
your federal,
Yes,
okay.
and remember,
And we don't, we had very limited way you could pass those through under your Vermont.
yeah, so Vermont's rules are, if it's a qualifying Schedule A medical deduction, you can take the amount up to the deduction less your standard deduction, less all your personal exemptions. So if there's a delta between those, you can take that delta. So again, my perspective is why not just follow those rules, right? That was put in place more recently than this alternative minimum tax. The legislature debated that, made conscious decisions about doing that. The bonus depreciation is an even bigger problem in my eyes, right? Because they're just following the rules that are already in place and they essentially don't get to depreciate at least a portion of that asset at all.
Okay, so we definitely will
Yeah, my team has done.
get
some
Ledge
work.
Council and JFO and your team in here and understand what we're doing.
The way that.
This is above my pay grade.
The way that one of my team has put it, especially with the tax year 20, where you're taking $10 from those not in the capital gain space, they said if you were fishing and you were fishing for tuna, and for every tuna you caught 10 dolphins, wouldn't you say you had a bad day? And that's ostensibly what's happening on the alternative minimum tax at this point, capturing the dollars from people. I suspect the legislature didn't intend to have that happen. But
Probably not for people with high med expenses at least, because I think that, that was, we missed that the first time because no one came in. And a lot of people came in about the charitable deduction
this was flagged for us after the medical exemption
after.
went in from tax preparers actually that said like, hey, we've got clients that this is happening to. We expect that it's unintentional.
Yeah, this it was subject to a great deal of negotiation with the other body about whether we did anything, so. have a look at it.
I'd definitely like to understand these medical expenses. So if it's federally qualified, those aren't elective procedures. Those are medical expenses that were for people that just were underinsured or even didn't have insurance for.
Yeah, I don't know all the federal rules, but I mean, generally that's what you're having, like people who've had a catastrophic event, right? And in fact, there's one other element to the Vermont exemption that I should speak to. I don't remember the exact statutory language, but essentially certain payments to certain continuing care facilities are
I
not.
was gonna say, long-term care comes in there, and you draw down from your IRA, that's then income. The next day, you write a check for the same or greater amount to the nursing home. Memory care is a big and expensive one. And you can't deduct that payment or the totality of that payment from your Vermont taxes. And that I lost.
We're happy to support however we can on all of these.
So it's a good time to take a look at that.
You think you're wrapping up? Can I double back to EITC? with
Yeah,
that question?
we're cutting into our break time. We're down to 10 minutes.
Never mind.
We will be coming back to all of these. And again, this will be money out the door. We're trying to get money in the door, or other bills are trying to get money in the door, so. Look at all of it.
Happy to come back whenever you'd like.
We'll have you back.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, okay. We are now on a 10-minute break. We didn't get one yesterday. And we are going to come back. These are all our new bills. We're gonna walk through 68 deduction for student loan payments. And to surcharge our non-primary dwellings. So that is in there.